The desert doesn't keep secrets, it buries them. Under layers of rock and sand, it holds tales older than memory, of spirits and curses, of blood spilled on sacred ground. Most folks who ride these lands are running from the living, from a sheriff's posse or a hangman's noose. But some places, the real danger ain't the living. It's the long, lonely dead. And the dead have all the time in the world to wait for their due. The sun was a merciless god in the Arizona territory, a blazing copper coin pinned to an endless canvas of bleached blue sky. It beat down on the cracked earth, on the skeletal remains of saguaro cacti, and on the lone rider whose silhouette shimmered in the heat haze. That rider was Colt McRae. His face was a roadmap of a hard-lived life, etched with the dust of a dozen trails from Montana to the Mexican border. The leather of his duster was worn thin, the brim of his hat curled from sun and rain, and the Colt peacemaker strapped to his hip rested with the familiar weight of an old friend. He'd come to Dry Hollow seeking nothing more than a few weeks of quiet, a full bottle of whiskey, and a bed that didn't rock with the rhythm of a moving train. The name itself promised tranquility, a place so parched and forgotten, even trouble would die of thirst trying to find it. As he crested the last rise, the town materialized from the shimmering air, a sad collection of clapboard buildings huddled together as if for comfort against the vast, indifferent desert. A single main street, wider than it needed to be, cut through the center, bookended by a livery stable at one end and a sun-bleached church with a leaning steeple at the other. Smoke curled lazily from a few chimneys, the only sign of life in the oppressive midday heat. Colt nudged his weary mare, Dusty, forward. The horse's hooves kicked up puffs of red dust that hung in the still air like forgotten ghosts. The silence was the first thing that struck him as odd. Not the peaceful quiet of an afternoon siesta, but a heavy, watchful silence. The kind that precedes a rattlesnake's strike. The saloon doors were shut tight, the general store showed no customers, and not a single child's laughter echoed from the alleyways. It was a town holding its breath. He dismounted in front of the livery, the sign stable and feed painted in faded letters. An old man with a face like a dried apple and eyes clouded with cataracts emerged from the shadows, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. "Howdy," Colt said, his voice raspy from the trail. "Need a stall for my horse. A good rub down and a full bag of oats. I'll be in town a while." The stable hand squinted at him, then at the setting sun that was beginning to paint the western mesas in hues of blood and fire. "Staying a while, you say?" he rasped, a tremor in his voice. "Most folks are in a hurry to leave Dry Hollow, especially with night coming on." Colt raised an eyebrow. "Town got a curfew." The old man just shook his head slowly, taking Dusty's reins. "Some things are worse than a curfew, mister. You be watchful tonight. The shadows in Dry Hollow, they got teeth." Colt paid the man, his hand resting on the butt of his peacemaker out of instinct. He'd heard his share of tall tales and local superstitions, but the genuine fear in the old man's eyes was unsettling. He shrugged it off as the ramblings of a lonely elder and slung his saddlebags over his shoulder, heading for the saloon. If there was one place to get the measure of a town, it was its watering hole. The Gilded Scorpion Saloon was as grim inside as the town was outside. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, sawdust, and something else. Something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood. A few patrons were scattered around the room, nursing their drinks in near silence. A grim-faced bartender polished a glass with a dirty rag, his eyes flicking nervously towards the swinging doors every time they creaked. The piano in the corner was silent, its keys gathering dust. Colt dropped his saddlebags by a table in the corner and walked to the bar. "Whiskey," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet. The bartender poured a shot without a word, his hand trembling slightly. Colt downed it in one go, the familiar burn a welcome sensation. He gestured for another. "Quiet night," Colt observed, leaning against the bar. The bartender finally looked at him. His eyes were hollow, ringed with dark circles. "It's always quiet now," he muttered. "Since the disappearances started." "Disappearances?" Colt asked, his interest piqued. "Folks just vanish," the bartender whispered, leaning closer. "The Miller family, gone 2 weeks ago, left a full dinner on their table. Old man Hemlock, the prospector, disappeared right off his porch last week. And the whispers, the moaning on the wind when the moon is high," he shuddered, looking towards the window where the sky was deepening into a bruised purple. "It's the curse." Colt had dealt with bandits, cattle rustlers, and crooked lawmen. He wasn't a man who spooked easily. Curse? The old Indian curse? Another patron, a burly blacksmith with a scarred face, chimed in from his table. They say this town was built on their sacred burial ground. The spirits are waking up, taking their revenge. Colt scanned the room. Fear was a palpable thing, hanging in the air thicker than the cigar smoke. These weren't just spooked townsfolk. They were people living on a razor's edge, besieged by an unseen enemy. He spent the next hour listening, piecing together the grim tapestry of Dry Hollow's plight. He heard stories of shadowy figures seen flitting through the graveyard at midnight, of a chilling wail that echoed from the nearby caves, a sound that froze the marrow in your bones. They spoke of livestock found torn apart, not by coyotes or mountain lions, but by something with a malevolent intelligence. As night fell, a tangible dread descended upon the saloon. The patrons began to leave, one by one, scurrying home before full darkness claimed the street. Soon, only Colt and the bartender remained. "You'd best find a room, stranger," the bartender said, his voice low, "and bar the door. Don't open it for anyone or anything." Colt finished his whiskey, the weight of the town's fear beginning to settle on his own shoulders. He wasn't a hero, just a drifter. This wasn't his fight. His plan was to get a room at the boarding house, sleep with his gun under his pillow, and be on his way by sunrise. Let the ghosts of Dry Hollow keep their cursed town. He stepped out onto the main street. The moon, nearly full, cast a cold, silver light that seemed to bleach all the color from the world, rendering it in stark shades of black and gray. The silence was absolute now, a dead, breathless void. The wind had picked up, and it moaned through the gaps in the buildings, a mournful sound that did, indeed, sound like a distant cry of pain. It was easy to see how a town on edge could turn the whisper of the wind into the wail of a banshee. He was halfway to the boarding house when he saw her. She was standing in the shadow of the assayer's office, a figure so still she seemed part of the darkness itself. As he drew closer, the moonlight caught the silver in her raven-black hair and the glint of turquoise at her throat. She wore buckskin, intricately beaded, and her face, when she turned it towards him, was a striking canvas of high cheekbones and dark, piercing eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of centuries. She was Native American, but unlike any he had seen before. There was an aura of power around her, a quiet intensity that made the air crackle. "You are new here," she said. Her voice was not a question. It was as soft as the desert wind, yet it carried an undeniable authority. "Just passing through," Colt replied, his hand moving instinctively closer to his gun. She took a step out of the shadows, and he saw the intricate patterns tattooed on her hands. "No one is just passing through Dry Hollow anymore," she said. "You arrived for a reason, even if you do not know it yet. My name is Naya." "Colt, the air is wrong tonight, Colt," Naya said, her gaze sweeping the empty street. "The veil is thin. They are waking." Before Colt could ask who they were, a sound split the night. It was a scream, a raw, terrified shriek that came from the direction of the livery stable. It was cut off abruptly, followed by a sickening, wet crunch. Colt's instincts took over. He drew his peacemaker, the click of the hammer caulking sounding like a thunderclap in the silence. Naya didn't flinch. She simply looked towards the sound, her expression grim. "It has begun," she whispered. Colt didn't hesitate. He broke into a run, his boots pounding on the dusty street. He reached the livery stable in seconds, the large double doors slightly ajar. A single lantern inside cast flickering, distorted shadows. He pushed the door open, his gun raised, and the metallic smell of blood hit him like a physical blow. The old stable hand lay on the ground, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. His clouded eyes were wide with a terror that death had not erased. But that wasn't the most horrifying part. Standing over the body were two figures. They were dressed in the tattered remnants of old cowboy attire, their skin a pale, deathly gray under the lantern light. Their eyes glowed with a faint, malevolent phosphorescence, and their movements were stiff, jerky, like marionettes with tangled strings. One of them turned its head, a motion accompanied by the dry crackle of old bones. Its jaw hung slack, and a low, guttural moan escaped its throat as it fixed its glowing eyes on Colt. These were not men. They were corpses, walking and animated by some unholy force. The closest one lunged, its filth-caked fingers reaching for him. Colt fired. The bullet slammed into the creature's chest, knocking it back a step, but it didn't fall. It simply looked down at the hole in its shirt, from which no blood flowed, and then back at Colt, its dead eyes filled with a cold, relentless hatred. "They do not feel lead," Naya's voice said from behind him. She had followed him, moving as silently as a shadow. Colt fired again, this time aiming for the head. The shot connected with a sickening squelch, and the creature's head snapped back. It staggered, then fell to its knees and collapsed into a heap of rotting clothes and old bones, its inner light extinguished. The second one was on him. It was faster than it looked, grabbing his gun arm with a grip of iron. The cold of the grave seeped into Colt's skin from the touch. Its other hand, fingers curled into a claw, swiped at his face. Colt slammed the heel of his boot into the creature's knee. Bone shattered with a dry snap, and the creature's leg buckled, but its grip on his arm didn't loosen. It snarled, a sound of dry rot and graveyard dirt, its foul breath washing over him. Suddenly, Naya was there. She held a small leather pouch in her hand. With a flick of her wrist, she threw a pinch of fine, silvery powder into the creature's face. It shrieked, a high-pitched, unearthly sound, and stumbled back, clawing at its eyes. The silver dust seemed to burn it, sizzling on its dead skin like water on a hot skillet. "Now, Colt," she yelled. Freed from its grip, Colt didn't waste the opportunity. He aimed his peacemaker squarely between the creature's glowing eyes and pulled the trigger. The second corpse collapsed. Silence descended once more, broken only by Colt's ragged breathing. The smell of gunpowder and death hung heavy in the air. He looked at the still forms on the stable floor, then at the dead old man, and finally at Naya. She was calm, her dark eyes reflecting the flickering lantern light. "What in God's name were those things?" Colt asked, his voice strained. "The cursed ones," Naya replied, her voice low and somber. "The dead of Dry Hollow, risen by a curse that has been dormant for a generation. They are puppets, animated by a great and ancient anger." Colt reloaded his pistol, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. He had seen his share of horrors in the West, but nothing like this. This was a different kind of evil, one that defied logic and bullets. "This curse," he said, holstering his weapon. "How do you stop it?" Naya looked out into the moonlit darkness, towards the jagged peaks of the mountains that loomed over the town like silent, stone sentinels. "The curse is a knot woven from blood and betrayal. To untie it, we must find its heart. It lies buried in the past, in the very ground we stand on." She then turned her gaze back to him, and for the first time, Colt saw a flicker of something beyond her stoic calm, a hint of desperation. "I cannot do it alone. The forces that control them are hunting me as well." Colt looked from the bodies on the floor to the woman standing before him. His plan to leave at sunrise had just evaporated. He could ride away, leave this town to its ghoulish fate. It wasn't his problem. But the image of the old stable hand's terrified eyes, and the thought of the other townspeople cowering behind their barred doors, stirred something in him. He had spent a lifetime running, from his past, from attachments, from fights that weren't his. But this felt different. This was a darkness that, if left unchecked, would not be content to stay in Dry Hollow. "Looks like I'm staying a while after all," Colt said, his voice a low growl. "Where do we start?" A faint smile touched Naya's lips, a fleeting expression that briefly softened her features. "We start," she said, her eyes turning towards the distant, moon-drenched graveyard at the edge of town, where all death begins and ends. The wind howled outside, carrying with it the faint, chilling moan of the newly risen. The night in Dry Hollow was just beginning, and Colt McCrae knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this would be the longest night of his life. The air in the livery stable was thick with the stench of gunpowder, blood, and the grave. Colt McCrae reloaded his peacemaker, his movements precise and economical, a lethal delay honed over years of hard living. Each soft click of the cylinder rolling into place seemed to echo unnaturally in the heavy silence that followed the fight. The light from the single hurricane lamp danced on the rough-hewn walls, casting long, distorted shadows of the two living and the three deader, rather, the twice dead. Colt glanced at Naya. She stood perfectly still, her deep, dark eyes fixed not on the mangled corpses but out into the oppressive darkness of the main street. She showed no shock, no fear. Instead, she radiated a disquieting calm, as if she had expected this bloodshed all along. "More will come," she said, her voice low and steady, almost a whisper to herself. "The moon is nearing its zenith. The curse is gathering strength. Colt snapped the loading gate shut and holstered the pistol. You mentioned the graveyard, he stated, his voice a gravelly rasp. You said we start there. Why? Every river has a source, Naya replied, finally turning to meet his gaze. The lamplight caught the sharp planes of her face, revealing an ancient sorrow in her eyes. This curse is no different. It rises from desecrated earth, from violated bones. To understand it, we must go to where it sleeps. Colt gave a single, sharp nod. He had crossed a line the moment his first bullet had torn through the rotted skull of one of those things. Leaving was no longer an option, not out of heroism, but because of a simple truth of the West. You never turn your back on a predator you know is there. And these things, they were worse than any predator. They left the livery, leaving the old stableman to lie beside his attackers, a silent tableau of tragedy under the flickering lamplight. The main street of Dry Hollow now felt like a stage set for a ghoulish play. The cold, nearly full moon bathed the clapboard buildings in a spectral light, rendering the town a skeleton of itself. The wind moaned through the alleyways, carrying sounds that Colt now recognized not as the groaning of old wood, but as distant, bodiless whispers, like the trapped voices of the damned. The cemetery was perched on the western edge of town, a low hill overlooking the desiccated Badlands. A rusted, leaning wrought iron fence enclosed it, its gate hanging from a single hinge, creaking back and forth in the wind like a macabre invitation. The sandstone headstones and wooden crosses tilted at odd, weary angles, eroded by time, and the desert's harsh caress, looking like broken teeth jutting from the earth. Stunted, twisted junipers reached their skeletal branches toward the sky like bony arms. Watch your step, Naya warned as they passed through the gate. The ground here is not at peace. Colt could feel it. There was a palpable cold in the air, a bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the desert night's temperature. It felt as if they had stepped into a place where the laws of nature were thin and stretched. His hand never strayed from the worn grip of his peacemaker. They moved slowly among the graves, Colt's eyes scanning the shadows for any hint of movement. Naya, in contrast, was looking down, her gaze reading the hard-packed earth for signs he could not see. This place was not always a white man's graveyard, she said softly, pausing beside an unmarked patch of ground. Long before the first prospectors scarred this land, this was a sacred burial site for my people, a spirit ground. They were interred here to watch over the path to the holy caves in the mountains. She knelt, her fingers brushing the stone-hard dirt. They had respect for their dead. They believed a person's spirit remained bound to their bones, and to disturb them was to invite vengeance from the world beyond. And then my people came, Colt finished, his voice not a question but a flat, bitter statement. Naya looked up, her eyes reflecting the stark moonlight. They came for gold, led by a man named Jedediah Kane, the founder of Dry Hollow. My ancestors tried to negotiate. They offered to share the land, but not this burial ground. Kane saw their reverence as superstition, as weakness. He wanted it all. Her story was told without malice, only with the immovable weight of truth. There was a massacre, she continued. Kane and his men attacked in the dead of night. They slaughtered my tribe on this holy ground, the blood of warriors and innocents soaking the earth. To add insult to injury, Kane had this town built over their settlement and turned their burial ground into his own, burying his conquerors on top of the conquered. Now Colt understood. This wasn't just a haunted place. It was a profound sacrilege left to fester for decades. The curse, he said. It was the last breath of my tribe's final shaman, Naya confirmed, rising to her feet. My ancestor. With his own blood, he cursed the land. He decreed that no soul, native or settler, would know peace here until the earth was cleansed. He sealed the curse, let it lay dormant, a ticking clock of bone and blood, waiting to be woken. And it looks like someone wound the clock, Colt muttered, his gaze sweeping over the graves. It was then he noticed it. At first, it was just a sense of wrongness. But as he looked closer, he saw that the earth around several of the graves had been disturbed. This wasn't the work of spirits rising. This was the work of shovels. Fresh piles of dirt lay beside shallow pits, as if someone had been hastily unearthing the caskets. Naya, he said, his voice low. She was already beside him, her own eyes narrowed in concentration. This is not the work of the curse, she whispered. The spirits rise from within. They have no need to dig. They followed the trail of desecration, which led them to the crest of the hill, where one structure stood out from the humble markers. It was a mausoleum, built of marble that was now yellowed and cracked with age, but it still radiated an aura of arrogant permanence. A heavy iron door, emblazoned with an ornate K, guarded the entrance. "The Kane family crypt," Nia said, her voice as cold as the iron. The door was not locked. It grated open with a blood-curdling screech, revealing a steep flight of stone steps descending into a cold, waiting darkness. The stench of decay and century-old dust washed over them, a foul breath from the mouth of hell itself. Colt struck a match against the stone, the sudden flare of light feeble against the oppressive black. He found a rusty lantern hanging on a hook just inside, and after a moment, managed to coax its wick to life. Holding the lantern high, he led the way down. Nia followed, her steps silent on the stone. The air grew colder with each step, and a profound silence pressed in on them, so deep it felt like a physical weight on his eardrums. The crypt was a single, vaulted chamber lined with stone sarcophagi. Dust lay thick as a blanket on everything, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling like funeral shrouds. But the scene was one of utter chaos. Several of the heavy stone lids had been pushed aside, and the caskets within were splintered and broken. The skeletal remains of Dry Hollow's founding family were exposed, their bones scattered contemptuously across the floor. "What the hell happened here?" Colt breathed, raising the lantern higher. "This is an act of desecration," Nia said, her voice laced with a new, sharp anger. "A violation. Someone came here looking for something." Then the lantern light fell upon the back wall, and they both froze. Painted on the cold stone, and a substance that was unmistakably dark and crimson, were symbols. They were crude, jagged thing spirals that twisted inward like serpents, sharp angled lines that looked like shattered stars, and a recurring motif of an open, seeing eye. They pulsed with a faint, sickly luminescence in the lantern light, seeming to writhe on the stone. Nia let out a sharp, involuntary hiss. This was the first time Colt had seen her composure crack. She approached the wall, her face a mask of horrified recognition. "What are they?" Colt asked. "Blood magic," she whispered, the words tasting like poison in her mouth. "A forbidden art. A perversion of the sacred traditions." She reached out a hand but stopped short of touching the symbols, as if she feared they would burn her. "These are not the signs of my ancestors. This is not the original curse. This is something new. Something parasitic." A terrifying realization began to dawn on Colt. "You're saying the curse didn't just—" "No," Nia said, turning to face him, her eyes wide with a dreadful understanding. "Someone woke it. Someone is pouring gasoline on a fire that has smoldered for generations. They are not just witnessing this horror, Colt. They are controlling it. They are amplifying its power for their own purpose." The word hung in the dead air between them. Purpose. This wasn't random spiritual vengeance. It was directed. It was an attack. Before Colt could process the full implication, a sound came from the stairwell behind them, a low, scraping drag of stone on stone. He spun around, raising his peacemaker, the lantern casting his own giant, menacing shadow against the far wall. Blocking the entrance at the top of the stairs stood three figures, their forms silhouetted against the pale moonlight of the cemetery. As they began their stiff, jerky descent, their features became clear. They were the Miller familia farmer, his wife, and their young son, who had vanished from their dinner table 2 weeks prior. But their eyes held no recognition, only the same malevolent, phosphorescent glow as the corpses in the stable. Their skin was pale and waxy, their mouths hung slack, and from their throats came a low, unified moan that was the sound of utter despair. "They're using the recently dead," Colt snarled. "The bodies are fresher." 2 more figures shuffled into view behind them, their movements more coordinated than the ones before. They were using the dead as an army. There was no room to maneuver. The crypt had become a stone coffin. The Millers lurched forward. The father, a big man in life, swiped at Colt with a haymaker's punch that would have crushed his skull. Colt ducked under it, the corpse's cold knuckles grazing his hair. He fired point blank into its chest. The bullet punched through the rotting fabric of its shirt, but the creature barely flinched. "The head, Colt. It's the only way," Nia yelled, her voice sharp and commanding. Colt shoved the farmer back and fired again, this time aiming higher. The shot took the creature in the neck, making its head snap back, but it kept coming. From his side, the corpse of Mrs. Miller lunged, her fingers like claws reaching for his face. He was trapped between them. Suddenly, Naya moved. She thrust a small leather pouch into her hand and threw a pinch of its contents of fine, silvery white powder into the face of the attacking woman. The corpse shrieked, a sound that was painfully high and unnatural, and staggered back, clawing at its glowing eyes. The powder sizzled on its dead skin, emitting tiny puffs of acrid smoke. Salt and silver, Naya cried. It burns them. It severs the connection. The momentary distraction was all Colt needed. He sidestepped, aimed carefully, and put a bullet through the farmer's right eye. The creature's inner light went out instantly, and it collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut. He immediately turned his fire on the shrieking woman, and she fell beside her husband. But the young boy, no older than 10, was upon Naya, his small hands grabbing at her buckskin tunic with a natural strength. Behind him, the other two ghouls were closing in. Colt aimed at the boy and hesitated, his finger frozen on the trigger. The face was that of a child. "Do it," Naya grunted, struggling to push the small corpse away. "That is not a child anymore, Colt. It's just a vessel." Gritting his teeth against a surge of revulsion, Colt fired. The small body went limp. He and Naya were back to back now, the last two corpses advancing on them in the cramped, suffocating space. "We can't stay here," Colt yelled over the guttural moans of the dead. "We have to get out." "Block them," Naya commanded. As Colt fired his last two shots, forcing the ghouls back a step, Naya knelt. With a piece of sharpened flint drawn from her belt, she began frantically scratching a symbol into the dusty stone floor between them and the advancing dead, a circle containing a complex lattice of lines. As she drew, she chanted in a low, rhythmic language Colt didn't understand, her voice resonating with a strange power that made the air hum. The moment she completed the circle, it flared with a soft, blue light. The two advancing corpses reached the line and recoiled as if they had walked into a solid wall, hissing in frustration. "It won't hold them for long," Naya said, scrambling to her feet. "Reload." Colt was already ejecting spent casings and thumbing fresh cartridges into the cylinder. "What now?" "We run." They turned and bolted up the stairs, bursting out of the tomb and back into the cold night air. They didn't stop. They sprinted through the graveyard, the scraping sounds of more bodies clawing their way out of the earth echoing all around them. Hands erupted from the loose soil, grasping at their ankles as they ran past. They didn't stop running until they reached the relative safety of the main street, collapsing against the wall of the general store, chests heaving. The cemetery on the hill was now alive with movement, a horrifying tableau of dark, shuffling figures moving between the tombstones under the bloodless light of the moon. Colt leaned against the wall, the adrenaline beginning to fade, leaving a cold dread in its place. He looked at Naya, who was staring up at the haunted hill, her expression grim. They had gone to the cemetery seeking answers about a curse from the past. Instead, they found a terrifying new truth about the present. This wasn't just a ghost story. This was a war. An ancient evil had been awakened, and worse, it was being wielded as a weapon by a living, breathing puppet master who painted in blood and commanded an army of the dead. The nightmare in Dry Hollow had just found its devil. They found refuge in the one place in Dry Hollow that felt as abandoned as their hopes, the church. Its steeple leaned like a tired old man, and the dust inside was so thick it seemed to swallow sound. They barred the heavy oak doors, a futile gesture against an enemy that didn't need doors, but it offered a sliver of psychological comfort. Colt reloaded his peacemaker by the light of a single candle, the small flame dancing in the vast, holy darkness. The events in the crypt played over in his mind: desecrated graves, the scattered bones, and the sickeningly fresh blood of the symbols. "This man who is controlling them," Colt said, his voice a low growl that barely disturbed the silence. "Who is he?" Naya was kneeling before the altar, though not in prayer. She had laid out several small pouches and was examining a collection of dried herbs and mineral stones. "He is a ghost from my own past," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "His name is Silas." She explained that Silas had been one of her people, a gifted apprentice in the old traditions. But his ambition outstripped his wisdom. While Naya sought to understand the spirits, Silas sought to command them. He was drawn to the forbidden paths, to blood magic that twisted the natural order. For his transgressions, the elders had exiled him, branding him a renegade. "We thought he had died in the desert years ago," Naya continued, her fingers tracing the rim of a small clay bowl. But it seems he survived. And he found the story of Dry Hollow. He found the sleeping curse and saw it not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity, a weapon. He needs you, Colt stated, snapping his revolver shut. That's why he's hunting you. It's about your bloodline. Yes, Nia affirmed. As the last descendant of the shaman who cast the curse, my blood resonates with it. It is a key. With me, he could unlock its deepest powers, making it permanent, and binding every spirit here to his will. Colt felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. This was no longer just a fight for a town, it was a fight for this woman's soul. As he watched her, a memory surfaced, ugly and unwelcome. A mining town in the Colorado mountains, whispers of a curse, men going mad in the tunnels, shadows that moved on their own. He had been younger then, and scared. He had saddled his horse and ridden away, telling himself it wasn't his fight. He later heard the town had been wiped out, swallowed by the mountain. The guilt had been a quiet passenger on his journeys ever since. I ran from something like this once, Colt confessed, the words tasting like ash. Left a whole town to die. I won't run again. Nia looked at him, her dark eyes seeing more than he was saying. Then we must stop him. To do that, we must understand the curse better than he does. We must go to its heart, the true heart, the resting place of my ancestor, the shaman. Where is that? In the veiled caves, she said, her gaze distant. A sacred place deep in the mountains that overlook this valley. It is the source of the curse's spiritual energy. It is where we will find the knowledge to undo it. Their journey began an hour before dawn. The town was a tomb, its living inhabitants huddled behind locked doors, praying for a sunrise that offered no real promise of safety. The blacksmith, a burly man named Gus whose fear had been forged into grim resolve, had met them at the church doors. He'd spent the night melting down his meager silver heirlooms and casting them into a handful of bullets for Colt. They weren't much, but they were more than hope. The mountains were jagged teeth against the pre-dawn sky. As they rode into the Badlands, the desert itself seemed to resist them. Silas's influence was a poison in the air. Tumbleweeds seemed to move with a natural purpose, and the shapes of the mesas would trick the eye, appearing to shift and writhe at the edge of their vision. They entered a narrow canyon Nia called Echoing Gulch. The name was an understatement. The wind whistling through the rock formations carried with it the disembodied wails of the dead, a chorus of agony that threatened to unhinge the mind. He is trying to break us, Nia said, her voice calm amidst the spectral cacophony. He uses fear as a weapon. Quiet your mind, Colt. Focus on the rhythm of your horse, the feel of the leather in your hands. Anchor yourself to the living world. Colt did as she said, forcing the chilling sounds to become mere background noise. He watched Nia, saw how she moved with a serene confidence, a part of this harsh landscape, not a trespasser. She taught him to read the subtle signs of Silas's illusions, a shadow that fell the wrong way, a rock that seemed to shimmer in the cool air. Slowly, their two worlds began to merge, his pragmatic survival skills and her deep spiritual connection to the land. A silent trust was forged between them in that haunted canyon. After hours of travel, Nia led them to a sheer cliff face. We are here, she said. Colt saw nothing but solid rock. But Nia dismounted and walked to the wall, chanting softly. She pressed her hand against the stone, and with a low grinding sound, a section of the rock receded, revealing a dark opening hidden behind a shimmering curtain of falling sand. Faded, ancient symbols, protective wards were carved around the entrance. This was the entrance to the veiled caves. The air inside the caves was cool and still, carrying the scent of damp earth and something ancient, like time itself. The tunnels opened into a vast cavern, its ceiling lost in darkness above. The walls were covered in pictographs, painted in ochre and charcoal, depicting the history of Nia's people, great hunts, celestial events, and a final, tragic panel showing stick figures with rifles slaughtering her tribe. In the center of the cavern, on a raised dais of rock, was a simple and adorned stone sarcophagus, the tomb of the shaman. The spiritual energy here was immense, a humming pressure that made the hairs on Colt's arms stand up. As they approached the tomb, shadows detached themselves from the cavern walls. They were not the slow, shambling corpses from the town. These were tall, spectral figures, armed with phantom bows and lances. Their forms shimmered, and their eyes were points of cold, intelligent light. They were the spirits of the original Apache warriors, the tomb's eternal guardians. "Hold them off, Colt," Nia commanded, rushing to the sarcophagus. "I must speak to him." Colt drew his silver-laced bullets and his regular rounds, firing methodically. The phantom warriors were faster, more cunning. They flickered in and out of sight, their ghostly arrows passing harmlessly through the rock but promising a deathly chill if they found their mark. It was a desperate dance, Colt's grit and gunpowder against ancient, spectral fury. While he fought, Nia placed her hands on the sarcophagus and closed her eyes. Her chanting filled the cavern, her voice weaving a bridge across the centuries. She was locked in a spiritual communion with her ancestor, her mind flooded with images of the massacre, of his pain, and of the curse's intricate design. She learned the truth. The curse was a lock, and there were two keys. One was an act of ultimate sacrifice, a descendant's blood spilled willingly to appease the violated earth. The other was a ritual of cleansing. But the ritual required a powerful artifact, a sacred tribal relic called the Heartstone of the Ancients, which focused and purified spiritual energy. The vision from her ancestor ended with a clear image, Jedediah Kane, standing over the shaman's dying body, prying the glowing Heartstone from a leather pouch around his neck. Nia's eyes snapped open. "Colt, the Heartstone!" Kane stole it. At that moment, the phantom warriors faded away, their duty done. Nia rushed to Colt's side. "The stone is the key. It's the only way to break the curse without sacrifice. It must be in Dry Hollow, hidden somewhere Kane built." The Kane mansion stood on a hill overlooking the town, a dark, gothic silhouette against the dying sun. It had been abandoned for decades, a monument to a corrupt legacy, and now, it was Silas's throne room. Infiltrating it was a descent into a nightmare. Every shadow seemed to hold a waiting corpse. The risen dead stood as silent sentinels in the overgrown gardens and patrolled the decaying hallways. Colt moved with the quiet lethality of a predator, his peacemaker a tool of silent takedowns, while Nia used her knowledge to create diversions, a whispered word that made a flock of crows scatter, a pinch of powder that created a confusing scent that drew the dead away from their path. They found their way to Jedediah Kane's private study. The room was a shrine to his own avarice, filled with occult books and taxidermied animals. On his desk lay his personal journal. Colt flipped through the brittle pages, the spidery handwriting revealing a man consumed by greed and paranoia. He wrote of the massacre without remorse and described the Heartstone with a mix of fear and lust, calling it the key to the spirit world. The final entry spoke of the impending blood moon, a time of great power he hoped to harness before his death. Behind a massive, grim portrait of Kane himself, they found it, a heavy iron safe, built into the stone wall. "It has to be in there," Colt whispered, his hand on the dial. But as his fingers touched the cold metal, the room plunged into an unnatural cold. The flame of their lantern flickered and died. A smooth, mocking voice echoed from the shadows behind them. "I do appreciate you to doing all the hard work for me." Silas stepped from the darkness. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in a mix of stolen finery and tribal leather, his face a mask of cruel intelligence. His eyes glowed with a faint, purple energy. "The blood moon rises tonight," Silas said, his voice dripping with condescending power. "A rare celestial event that will amplify the curse 1,000-fold. With the Heartstone and the blood of a true descendant, I will not just control the dead of Dry Hollow. I will become a god, and this desert will be my kingdom." The fight was short and brutal. Silas didn't fight with fists or guns, but with pure, corrupting magic. He flung shards of shadow that cut like glass. He whispered to Colt, forcing visions into his mind of the Colorado mining town, making him relive his failure and feel the ghostly hands of its dead citizens pulling him down. Colt fought back with pure grit, his bullets tearing through Silas's illusions but failing to find their mark. Nia chanted words of protection, creating shields of shimmering air that deflected his attacks, but his power was too great. With a flick of his wrist, Silas sent a wave of dark energy that slammed Nia against a wall, knocking her unconscious. He then turned his full attention on Colt, pinning him to the floor with an invisible force that crushed the air from his lungs. "You have been a thorn in my side, Cowboy," Silas hissed, walking over to the safe. He placed a hand on it, and the metal lock glowed red before clicking open. Inside, nestled on velvet cloth, was the Heartstone. It was a piece of uncut turquoise, larger than a man's fist, that pulsed with a soft, internal light. Silas took the stone and then hoisted Naya's limp body over his shoulder. "Thank you for the key," he sneered at the helpless Colt. With his other hand, he overturned a massive candelabra, sending a river of fire across the dry floorboards and ancient books. "Enjoy the reckoning," Silas spat, and vanished into the shadows as the study erupted in flames. Choking on smoke, his body screaming in protest, Colt dragged himself out of the burning mansion just as its roof collapsed. He stood on the hill, wounded and beaten, watching his last chance burn against the night sky. The moon was rising, and it was a terrifying, bloody crimson. The curse was at its peak. Down in the town, a low, collective groan signaled that the time had come. From the desecrated cemetery, an army of the dead began to march. Every soul buried there, from Cain's first settlers to the most recently deceased, clawed its way from the earth. Their numbers were overwhelming. But Dry Hollow was not entirely without a soul. A barricade of wagons and furniture had been erected at the end of the main street. Behind it stood Gus the blacksmith, the saloon's bartender, and a handful of other terrified but resolute townsfolk, armed with shotguns, rifles, and farm tools. Colt staggered down the hill, his face a mask of smoke and grim determination. Seeing him, bloody but alive, ignited a spark of hope in the defenders. "They're coming," the bartender yelled. "Then we'll send them back to hell," Colt growled, checking his revolver. He took command, his voice cutting through their fear. "Aim for the head. Don't let them get close. Gus, your silver rounds are for the big ones." The siege began. It was a desperate, brutal battle under the light of the blood moon. The dead came in a relentless wave, their moans a deafening roar. Colt was a whirlwind of motion, his shots precise and deadly. The townsfolk fought with the courage of cornered animals. But for every one they put down, 3 more took its place. The barricade splintered. They were being overwhelmed. Colt knew they couldn't win. This was a battle of attrition they were destined to lose. The only way to stop the army was to kill its general. "Gus, hold this line as long as you can," Colt yelled over the din of battle. Leaving the defense in the blacksmith's capable hands, Colt broke from the barricade, using the chaos as cover. He began a one-man assault on the cemetery. He fought his way up the hill, a lone figure against a tide of the dead, his guns blazing. He reached the crest, the site of the Cain mausoleum. In the center of a ring of standing stones, Silas had chained Naya to a makeshift altar. The heartstone was on a pedestal before her, pulsing with a sickening red light that matched the moon above. Silas was chanting, his arms raised, drawing power from the moon, the curse, and the stone. The final confrontation began. It was a desperate duel of Colt's iron will and gunpowder against Silas's unholy magic. Colt dodged bolts of raw energy, using tombstones as cover, his silver bullets finding their mark and making the shaman scream in pain and rage. He was faster, smarter, and driven by a righteous fury. With a final, desperate gambit, he threw a handful of dirt into Silas's eyes, and in that split second of distraction, he fired his last silver bullet. It struck Silas in the shoulder, shattering the bone and breaking his concentration. Colt lunged forward, using his knife to slash the ropes binding Naya. Enraged, Silas roared and unleashed all the power he had gathered. The heartstone flared, and a vortex of screaming spectral energy erupted from the ground, threatening to tear the entire hilltop apart. The ritual, Naya gasped, now free. "Colt, buy me time." While Colt engaged the wounded but furiously powerful Silas, Naya scrambled for the heartstone. Ignoring the maelstrom of energy, she clutched the stone and began her own chant counter-ritual, the Psalm of Cleansing. Her voice, pure and strong, cut through the demonic shrieking. Her own life force began to flow into the stone, the corrupted red light slowly giving way to a pure, turquoise glow. The spirits of her ancestors, drawn by her call and the stone's purification, materialized from the vortex. But this time, they did not attack. They turned their spectral gaze upon Silas, the true desecrator of their legacy. They swarmed him, their ghostly hands tearing not at his flesh, but at his stolen power. As the eastern sky began to pale and the blood moon waned, Colt saw his opening. He leveled his peacemaker at the heart of the distracted, screaming shaman, and emptied the cylinder. At the same moment, Naya cried out the final word of her ritual. The heartstone erupted in a wave of brilliant, golden light. It washed over the cemetery, the town, and the entire valley. The screaming vortex vanished. The risen dead, from the army at the barricade to the ones on the hill, crumbled into dust, their tortured spirits finally released. The curse was broken. Silas, his body riddled with bullets and his power stripped away, dissolved into a pile of black ash. As the first true rays of dawn broke over the mountains, silence fell upon Dry Hollow. It was a silence of peace. The town was battered, scarred, but it was free. Naya, weakened but alive, stood with Colt on the hill, the now cool and peaceful Hearthstone in her hand. Below, the surviving townsfolk emerged from behind their shattered barricade, looking up at the sunrise as if seeing it for the first time. "It's over," Colt said, the exhaustion of 100 lifetimes in his voice. "No," Naya replied, a faint smile on her lips. "It's begun." She would stay, the guardian of the cleansed land. And Colt, looking from her resilient face to the dusty town below, knew his drifting days were done. He had not just found a place to rest, he had found a place to stand, a cause to fight for, and a connection he never knew he was searching for. Together, they watched the sun rise over Dry Hollow, the past finally laid to rest, and a new and certain future dawning before them.